Our next panel is composed by Professor Jacques Lezra and from the University of Riverside, Department of Hispanic Studies, and Tyler Williams from Midwestern University, Department of English, Humanities, and Philosophy. He's also the coordinator of the philosophy program. Our first speaker is Professor Lezra. His talk is titled Forgiving, for Example, and by Example. Let me tell you a little bit about Professor Lezra for those who don't know his achievements. He is a distinguished professor of Spanish at the University of California, Riverside, and he teaches at the Department of Hispanic Studies. His most recent books are República Salvaje, de la Naturaleza de las Cosas, published through Ediciones Macul, 2019. On the Nature of Marxist Things, translation has Philology, Fordham 2018, and Translating Machines, a genealogy of the ends of global thought, published in London, Rowman, and Littlefield 2017, and Contra todos los fueros de la muerte, el suceso cervantino, published through La Cedra 2016. Recent co-edited volumes include Thinking with Balibar 2020, Allegory and Political Representation 2017, and Lucretius and Modernity 2016. His 2010 Wild Materialism, The Ethics of Terror and the Modern Republic appeared in Spanish translation in 2012 and in Chinese translation in 2013. Lezra has edited collections on the work of Althusser, Balibar, and Macri, and on Spanish republicanism, and published articles on Cervantes, Shakespeare's Measure for Measure, contemporary and early modern translations, theories and practices, Freud, Althusser, Woolf, animality studies, and other topics. He is the co-translator into Spanish of Paul de Man's Blindness and Insight, and with Emily Apter and Michael Wood, he co-edited the Dictionary of Untranslatables in 2014. The English translation of Vocabulaire Européen de Philosophie, that was the end of the sentence. Paul North and he edited the Fordham University Press book series on the idiom. So I will leave this spot for Professor Lezra, who can talk without a mask if he is necessary.
Thank you so much, Paula. Thank you, Gonzalo. I'm going to be talking through a little text that has a different title from the one that was offered to you by Paula and was on the program, because last minute is always best. So the little thing that I'm going to present is called Forget and Forgive, the Schema of Abolition. And in the world of my desires, this forms part of my new book, that who knows if it will. Besides hoping that you'll forgive me for not being able, because of a combination of Zoom and health issues, to attend the opening session of the conference in person, I have three matters on which I will have to beg your pardon. In the new title that I've offered, I'm referring to the Schema of Abolition, placing this brief talk in a long and distinguished line of work promoting the abolition of so many catastrophic policies and institutions, the abolition of slavery, of the death penalty, of the family, of the police. What I'm presenting today as the Schema of Abolition patently borrows or steals from the historical prestige of this distinguished line of intellectual work and from the long history of political and social struggle that the term abolition gathers together. For this improper borrowing, if it is improper, or for this theft, I must beg your forgiveness. Today, in the world of Black Lives Matter and of the rise of global ethno-nationalisms, it may seem especially improper to utter the term abolition in an academic context, especially when, as now, the person using it has no or very little obvious connection to these historic struggles. And yet I'll do so and assume those risks. You'll also note that Derrida, whose seminar on pardon and perjury we are discussing today, uses the term abolition extremely rarely in the two volumes of the seminar, and only with respect to the abolition of the death penalty in the United States, and never presuming to offer the concept's schema. For this improper importing of the term abolition into Derrida's concerns, then also your forgiveness. Finally, in my title, I've taken the liberty of flipping the terms of common speech as a sort of experiment, and I'll hope you'll forgive me for it as well. I wrote forget and forgive rather than the usual English forgive and forget. Well, why this last? What does my experiment in flipping the order of forgetting and of forgiving get us? We often take forgive and forget as an injunction. This is what you should do. It's morally proper and socially useful. When you suffer a wrong or a tort, you should first forgive, then forget the injury. Forgiveness is followed by forgetting. And we might even say more forcefully that there is no forgiveness without subsequent forgetting. After all, remembering a tort or a grievance after ostensibly having forgiven it is a way of maintaining forever the power to withdraw forgiveness and to say, see, you did it again. This time it's worse because there's an antecedent. So now for this tort or grief, you will have to beg forgiveness for both, for this one and for its antecedent and aggravating example. I say it's morally proper to forget after we forgive, and the long religious tradition stands on just this notion. A celebrated passage in Hebrews 10 reads in the King James Version, "This is the covenant that I will make with them after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my laws into their hearts, and in their minds will I write them." And here, there's a kind of gap in the editorial tradition that is almost always supplied by the words, "and then he said," followed by, "and their sins and iniquities will I remember no more. Now, where remission of these is, there is no more offering for sin." Right? So bear in mind that this kind of constellation or configuration here, first an inscription I will put into of laws into the hearts, and in minds will I write them, followed by a kind of manuscript hesitation or editorial ellipsis supplied by historical tradition with the terms "then he said," followed by "sins and iniquities will I remember no more," the abolition or the erasure of these sins and iniquities. The word in Hebrews is remission. Now, where remission of these iniquities and sins is, there is no more offering for sin. Remission is a weakened form of the juridical form that interests me here, which is abolition. In Castilian, the expression is explicitly theological, less an injunction or an exhortation than a description. Where English says forgive and forget, Castilian says perdona y olvida, but the full expression of this, recalling God's merciful way of proceeding with respect to human failings, is Dios perdona y olvida. That's the full expression. God's example is to be followed, better or worse, by each of us in his or her own way, and with degrees of success that vary as well, since none of us will ever match the sovereign and divine example. Similarly long political traditions stand on the usefulness of forgetting after I forgive, although rather differently. the tradition that arrogates the power of pardon, granting pardon to the sovereign, with Derrida, in an important extempore addition to the seminar, calls for one of only 2 times in the seminar in which he uses the expression le droit régalien de grâce. Le droit régalien de grâce. The sovereign or royal or regal or régalien is a complicated, weird, little, and very unusual juridical term that he uses, as I say, twice and only in this technical sense in the course of the seminar, though in another spot that I'll talk about in just a little bit, he goes into it in greater depth. This arrogated power of pardon of the sovereign, the sovereign, exercises forgiveness in the modality of the juridical forgetting of the crime or of its consequences. It's a power of pardon, mercy, absolution, amnesty, and most forcefully, abolition. Though with the correlative injunction that the exercise of the sovereign régalien right to provoke forgetting, the right to amnesty or abolition itself must be remembered. And it is exercised so that it is remembered. Thus too the tradition arguing for both the reforming and the punitive qualities of justice. Once you've done the time, the crime is behind us both, behind you, behind us, behind me, behind the social body, but this on the condition that the substantiality, the sovereignty of that social body be by the same gesture remembered. And of course, this ordering, the standard order, forgive and forget, makes sense in a way that my flipped version, forget and forgive, does not. In fact, there's a kind of absurdity, a grammatical, semantic, and logical absurdity to the expression forget and forgive, since the act of forgiving requires an object, a predicate that's simply withdrawn, absent, obliterated, abolished, if we have already forgotten the wrong or the tort that we're meant to be forgiving. On its face, forgiving requires that your injury to me be fresh and present to me, that it be an object for me on which I can act from the depth of my grief or harm. And when I forgive you, I'll say, that's all behind us now. Let's forget it. Let's start over. I mark a caesura. 2 objects are in my hand for my use, for my magnanimity, the injury or tort that I forgive, and the scheme of time, which I can hold and mark, and cut, on which I can mark events and from which I can erase them. Pardon and forgetting, pardon, then forgetting, Dios perdona y a continuación olvida. My laws are put into your hearts and written in their minds, and then, manuscript trembling, their sins and iniquities will I remember no more. Your act and the time we seem to share are now in my hands. I remember your act no more, and don't you forget that your time, the time marked by the before of your act and the after of my forgetting, are mine to mark. The old and terrible connection that Derrida remarks throughout the seminar on pardon and perjury between pardon and sovereignty concerns not only the sovereign's right to pardon this or that lesion or crime, it concerns the fantasy of subjective sovereignty over the event. Or, if we want to frame the matter in ethical rather than political terms, the fantasy of subjective responsibility for and to the event. So again, what does the flipping of the order of forgetting and forgiving get us? It's a controversial experiment in at least this way. As we've seen, by flipping the order of forgetting and forgiving, I've committed a sort of wrong, a tort, a lesion against the order of grammar, against semantics, against logic. Who will hold me to account? Who can pardon me for it? Minimally, flipping the order of forgetting and forgiving gets at something unstated in Derrida's seminar regarding the relation between pardon, the claim of sovereign subjectivity, and temporality or causation. The tremulous sequencing of two acts that we just heard in the tentative, then inserted in the passage that I read you from Hebrews. We can formalize and at the same time open to question the standard expression forgive and forget. I'd said that English understands the expression as an injunction. I, unspecified, hereby enjoin on you to forgive, and then on you to forget, or on you then to forget. Forgiving and forgetting are to be predicated of the same subject. Otherwise, the whole operation is specious, or worse, it's to be executed in bad faith or administratively, as if there were one administrative unit or faculty with the power to forgive and another with the power to forget. At least the ethical dimension of this injunction cries out against this bureaucratic parceling of responsibility, probably the political one as well, if not perhaps the psychological one. So on analysis, forgive and forget seems built on a classic and reciprocal scene of address, where the schema of performance is abolished by what I'll call the schema of abolition. I, unspecified, enjoin on you to become the subject of two parallel performative acts undertaken in sequence. I, the addressee now, hereby forgive, and I, still the addressee, hereby forget. But that scheme of performance requiring the prioricity, the aprioricity of time, requiring a grammar, semantics, and logic of personal address, requiring a single subjectivity of which two performative acts are predicated in parallel, that scheme is abolished. The scheme of performance, I said, is reciprocal because the force of my injunction, its felicity, depends on a prior scheme of recognition and acknowledgement. I have standing with respect to you to enjoin, and you are the proper addressee of my injunction, and we both recognize our standing. This is the reciprocal structure of the scheme of performance. But just what order of priorness or aprioricity is at issue? Our identity is bound up in this relation that we bear to one another. It trembles at abolition, at the possibility that the priorness of the scheme of recognition and acknowledgement will turn out not to be given and invulnerable, but also subject to use, lesion, inversion, effacement, forgetting, abolition. Abolition already haunts the scheme of performance because what you forgive, you then so forget that it can no longer return to bear witness or be witnessed or construed as a lesion or a tort. The first attestations of the term abolition stress the concept's relation already in the French of the 14th century to effacement. In Castilian, the 1726 Diccionario de Autoridades is explicit. Abolir, it says, borrar de la memoria perpetuamente alguna cosa, darla al olvido como si no hubiera sido, as if it had not been, como si no hubiera sido. Es voz forense tomada del latino abolere. Abolición, it says, is la acción de borrar, the action of erasing, u olvidar perpetuamente, or perpetually forgetting. As if you could guarantee that forgetting could be perpetual. I'll come back to this. Viene del latín abolitio, que significa excluir. Once we've parsed the phrase forgive and forget this way, the stakes of the matter and the internal complications that haunt and structure the schemas of performance and abolition become clearer. For it's possible for me to forgive you, or to exercise the power of pardon that my position invests in me by saying performatively, I forgive you, or in Castilian, te perdono, or I pardon you, or I grant you mercy, or I hereby confirm this letter of abolition, as such instruments were called before abolition's modern usages became current. These are exemplary and classically performative speech acts of the sort that J.L. Austin initially refers to in How to Do Things with Words as legal formulas. To utter them is to make what they predicate come about in the world legally, that is, by virtue of an agreed, instituted code, in this case, a legal code. The expression, I pardon, eventually falls among the class of illocutionary speech acts that Austin calls extra-citive. You recall that How to Do Things with Words begins with one taxonomy of speech acts, and then that falls apart wonderfully in the course of the work, and essentially Austin throws up his hands and says, "Ah, no, it's just messy." And so part of this messiness is the move towards from performatives to illocutionaries, and within illocutionary, one of the categories is this thing that he calls the exercitive. That is the giving of a decision in favor of or against a certain course of action or advocacy of it. It's a decision, Austin continues, that something is to be so as distinct from a judgment that it is so. It is advocacy that it should be so as opposed to an estimate that it is so. It is an award as opposed to an assessment. It is a sentence as opposed to a verdict. It makes it happen by virtue of the statement. As with all examples of performative utterances with which How to Do Things with Words opens, the speech act of pardoning becomes troubling for Austin. This is how he worries it in his original English. So note, when I say his original English, it's because the translations of this section of How to Do Things with Words run into horrendous difficulties. I won't have time to go into them. I'll just mention one of them, the one into Spanish. He says, we've distinguished roughly cases where you must have certain intentions from more particular cases where you must intend to carry out a certain further course of action, where use of the given procedure was precisely designed to inaugurate it, whether making it obligatory or permissive. Instances of this more specialized procedure are undertaking to perform an action, of course, and probably also christening. The whole point of having such a procedure is precisely to make certain subsequent conduct in order and other conduct out of order. And of course, for many purposes with, for example, legal formulas, this goal is more and more nearly approached. But other cases, he says, are not so easy. And of those cases, pardoning is crucial. Or similarly, he says, I entreat you to do something. You accede, and then I protest. Am I out of order? Probably yes. But there is a constant tendency to make this sort of thing clearer. As, for example, when we move from I forgive to I pardon, or from I will, either to I intend or to I promise. Okay, so this movement from I forgive to I pardon is the movement from a purely intentional construction to juridical, effective, and performative, explicitative formula. I say that the matter becomes troubling in Austin's original English because the Castilian translation by Gerardo Carrillo and Eduardo Rabosi in Paidós, which is still, I believe, the only extant translation of How to Do Things with Words into Spanish, as well as the standard translation, though quite differently, they run into problems where neither language draws the distinction between the intentional register in which forgiveness operates, I forgive you, and the juridical one in which pardoning works. The Castilian translation solves the problem by simply dropping pardoning from Austin's text entirely. Their translation. Austin's text reads, there is a constant tendency to make this sort of thing clearer, as for example, when we move from I forgive to I pardon, or from I will either to intend or to I promise. This becomes, in Castilian, probablemente sí, pero hay una tendencia constante a poner más en claro este tipo de cosas, como por ejemplo, cuando en lugar de decir lo haré, digo prometo. So, the whole dynamic of perdón and forgiveness disappears because the Castilian doesn't have both perdón and forgiveness. It has perdón, which covers pardon and, oh, I'm sorry, I beg your pardon. So this is their solution is simply to take it out and say, well, you know, you can't do that thing with that word in Spanish. You can do all sorts of other stuff, but that word is absolutely excluded. All this then, as I say, is possible in the scheme that makes possible forgive and forget. A scheme, many schemes, distributing positions, persons, and powers exist, these schemes. We inhabit these schemata, which are grammatically the system of personal pronouns in natural languages, logically the scheme of predication and entailment, phenomenologically the scheme ordering the event before our response to it, the event to forgive and to forget before either forgiving or forgetting, and forgiveness then before forgetting. These schemata work reciprocally as cause, product, and instrument of the gross schemes we know materially emplace us: economic schemes, social, ideological, cultural, biopolitical schemata. The system of schemata is the condition of felicity for my enjoining you to forgive now and here, and then to forget. All of this is possible, I said, in the system of schemata of the performative or the exercitive, the schema of performance. But is forgetting something that I can perform in this way? Can I say to you, I hereby forget you, and expect that uttering the phrase makes what it predicates come about in the world by virtue of an agreed, instituted code? Imagine writing the first sentences of a work. Call it a novel. You write something like this: en un lugar de la Mancha, de cuyo nombre no quiero acordarme. No ha mucho tiempo que viví un hidalgo de los del Alto Astillero. Cervantes's English translators have notorious trouble with the expression no quiero acordarme, which roughly speaking is, I really don't want to remember, or I want not to remember. No quiero acordarme. Right? The thing about it is the submission of the faculty of memory to the faculty of the will, querer. Shelton, Cervantes' first translator, says, there lived not long since in a certain village of the Mancha, the name whereof I purposely omit. I purposely omit. This is no quiero acordarme becomes I purposely omit. It's a gentleman of their calling, that blah, blah, blah. Ormsby, the 19th century translator of Cervantes, renders it like this: in a village of La Mancha, the name of which I have no desire to call to mind, there lived not since blah, 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 blah. And recently, E.D. Grossman writes, somewhere in La Mancha, in a place whose name I do not care to remember, a gentleman lived not long ago, etc. Cervantes' expression, querer recordar, no quiero acordarme, becomes I purposely omit, or I have no desire to call to mind, or I do not care to remember. Purpose, desire, care. Imagine if it were possible by an act of will or of wanting, of querer, an act of purpose, even of desire or care. Imagine if it were possible not to remember. Imagine if it were possible to abolish a memory simply by speaking the sentence, I hereby abolish this memory. Imagine if memory were at the hands of our will. Imagine the grief we could save ourselves. Imagine if an act of speech, with or without my full intention committed to it, we can sidestep Austin's worries about the differences between the intention to forgive and the juridical effectiveness of pardoning. Imagine if the world of experience yielded to our will in this way. I hereby forget my mother's death. I hereby forget lost love, disappointment. I hereby forget my pain or the name of a certain village of La Mancha. Nothing in our experience and nothing in the history of Western philosophical treatments of the will or of want or of experience or of purpose, desire, or caring to authorizes us to believe that such outcomes are possible. Simply, the abolition of memory is not a predicate of a performative utterance. So my experiment, Forget and Forgive, requires us to bracket our intuitive sense that forgiving and forgetting can indeed not only be predicated on the same subject, and are necessarily predicated on the same subject, but predicated on the condition that a prior scheme offers invulnerable positions or persons that a subject and her addressee both recognize in ways each recognizes in and of the other, and otherwise the whole operation is specious. We had rejected as scandalously unethical, politically questionable, the bureaucratic administrative parceling off of functions, the function to forgive and the function to forget. A single subject, a single identity was interpolated or enjoined under the schema of performance. This injunction depended on arrogating to the schema and to the sovereign and deciding subject priority and dominion, not only over the addressee, but also and necessarily over the time of the address. The scheme of abolition is other. It's precisely the suspension of the scheme of performance from within the scheme of performance. At this point, I'm going to give you just a summary of where the rest of the argument leads us. I've given you its gross outlines, the thesis. I referred to the arcane description that Derrida gives in the 1999 seminar on the rights of pardon. He notes ad libidem in the 7th session that the position of pardon and even the political position of pardon in the United States, the grace of pardon, is the position of sovereignty. Le droit régalien de grâce, the sovereign, régalien, regal right of grace. C'est le droit naturellement du souverain. It's a natural right of the sovereign. He has no accounts to render on it to anyone. Il n'a de compte à rendre à personne. Il est au-dessus des lois. He's above the law. Right? So the position of the Speech Act of pardoning, whatever its structure, is natural to the sovereign and places the sovereign above the law in that exceptional inside-outside structure that Derrida often associates with sovereignty. He's glossing in the seminar on March 10th, 1999, the articulation ontothéologique du motif de la souveraineté, the ontotheological articulation of the motif of sovereignty. There, he says, in the place of pardon, of this grâce régalienne, this is le lieu de tous les procès et de toutes les terreurs. This is the place of all trials and of all terrors. The expression droit régalien de grâce crops up once before in February of 1998, the séance de discussion, which is get together, they have a little séance de discussion at the end of the term, and they just pull stuff together. Derrida says, I know very well that the word pardon does not exist in the juridical ambit, dans le droit. It exists in the exception to the juridical ambit or to the law. Dans l'exception au droit, qui est le droit régalien de grâce, par exemple, which is the regalian or sovereign right to grant grace, for example. Or the American pardon. This, it says pardon in French, but we have to assume that Derrida would have said something like ou le pardon américain, just to distinguish it from the pardon français, which is not the same as the American pardon. He says, but the figure of pardon, is not a juridical figure. It's precisely the figure of the natural sovereignty or the naturality of sovereignty, which is not a juridical figure itself. It installs the power of the juridical, but it's not itself a juridical figure. He's much more explicit in treating the notion of droit régalien in the 2004 essay called Pardonner, l'impardonnable et l'imprescriptible, which is actually written way before 2004, but is only published in the Cahiers L'Herbe that we were talking about before. So I would, I'm not going to read you the very long and detailed analysis that he gives of the grâce régalienne, simply to say, and in conclusion, that this position of the natural right to pardon of the sovereign, that places the sovereign at the initial and originating position of sovereignty, but also of the juridical schema upon which the schema of performance is based, the schema of performance that I was describing to you before, that reciprocal interpolation and reciprocal address between my injunction and your being enjoined into a double speech act of forgetting and of pardoning. That scheme of the installation of the natural right to pardon in the sovereign is the condition of the abolishment, and the abolishing in the strict sense, well, in a sense of the scheme of performance as well. So the scheme of performance is based in, but also abolished by this initial positioning of the sovereign as the natural holder of the capacity to pardon. Where does that leave us with respect to this strange articulation of sovereignty, pardon, temporality, and so on? And I'll just conclude with 2 words on this. The issue that I started with was the way it was proposing that the injunction, forgive and forget, presented us with a scheme of performance that affirms the pre-existence of schemata from which the conditions of felicity for every performative are then installed. That a prioricity and the sovereignty of that prior set of schemata with respect to any potential speech act and any fantasy of the conjunction of a performative of pardoning and a non-performative of forgetting, that a prioricity of those schemata is precisely what makes it possible for the concept of the naturality of the sovereign to be installed, but also what makes it, what is destroyed by the notion of the naturality, the natural power of the sovereign to grant grace or pardon. Thank you.
So Tyler Williams is who is going to present a talk, which I think you will read. Pardon the Cliché. Is that right? Is that French? Okay. He's assistant professor of English, Humanities and Philosophy, and the current coordinator of philosophy at Midwestern State University. With double cross or DJS cross, he's the translator of 2 books by Marc Crépon, The Vocation of Writing, Literature, Philosophy, and the Test of Violence, published by SUNY Press in 2018. And more recently, The Trial of Hatred, an essay on the refusal of violence, a very nice volume published by Edinburgh in 2020, well, this year. Additionally, he is the editor of the forthcoming book, Plasticity, The Promise of Explosion, also through Edinburgh, a collection on essays by Catherine Malabou. Some of his articles and translations, I'm not going to name them all, and reviews have appeared or are forthcoming in such journals as Diacritics, Epoché, College Literature, CR, the New Centennial Review, Boundary 2, and Critical Inquiry. And I will leave you with Tyler, after which we're going to have a session of questions.
All right, thank you for the introduction. The title of this talk is Pardon the Cliché. Pardon in English, American English. Okay, so my engagement with forgiveness as a philosophical and ethical problem, as it were, sits within a broader critique of what I call post-violence literature. Roughly speaking, I identify what I call post-violence literature as a desire to align literature, or something that goes by the name of literature, with a vantage of peace, as if literature's resistance to violence, or literature's non-violence, its protest, not only stands on the side of peace, but indeed reclaims, like a type of salvation, a primary peace. So post-violence literature is at least the desire for something like this. I want to show that a tendency to align forgiveness with a reclamation of peace, and therefore to align something about literature within this generalized trajectory toward forgiveness in this sense, overlooks, or at least to some degree obviates, a more constitutive first violence. In Derrida's account of the impurity of forgiveness, he famously argues that there can be no forgiveness where there is no shared language or idiom. So for you to forgive me, I must understand the terms of your forgiveness, and I must be able to articulate this comprehension to you, and vice versa in some way. The victim and perpetrator must, in some sense, speak the same language. And yet, of course, this communicability immediately throws forgiveness into an economy of exchange and reciprocity, which, as Derrida shows in his essay on forgiveness, as well as in his Given Time seminars, ruins both the gift and forgiveness, the gift of forgiveness, as a gift and as forgiveness. Thus, the only gift, the only forgiveness worthy of the name must happen, he says, aneconomically, by surprise, as an event, a miracle, idiomatically, or singularly. And yet, of course, such a radically singular event could never be recognized as such. And so as a result, Derrida's logic leaves us within the aporetic position in which the only forgiveness possible is as its impossibility. Forgiveness, as he puts it, can only forgive the unforgivable. So with the rest of my presentation today, I want to extend Derrida's argument to address one area that I think is implicit with, or within, and also consistent with his account, but which, at least in this essay on forgiveness, he doesn't make explicit. I extend Derrida's argument to show that the very possibility of this mutual understanding of the victim and the perpetrator speaking the same language in order to be able to forgive invites yet another form of unforgivable violence, namely the cliché, a language so mutually recognizable and quote unquote common that it violates the idiomaticity of forgiveness. If a language of forgiveness must be addressable to the other, to use Paul Celan's term, then this addressability is constitutively contaminated by the specter of the cliché. Moreover, in the face of critical discourses that evoke literature as an outside to this economy of cliched violence, and thus perhaps is the only chance of forgiveness, I'll conclude by arguing that literature can only remain part of the economy of violence it purportedly resists. So in 1977, in his inaugural lecture upon being appointed to the chair of literary semiology at the Collège de France, Roland Barthes famously stated that all language is, quote, quite simply fascist. Why fascist? Because, Barthes argues, language is inherently classificatory and restrictive, since my speech compels me to address others a particular way, and thus always ensnares me within some domain of power. As a result, he says, a speech system is defined less by what it permits us to say than by what it compels us to say. And after all, Barthes adds, quote, fascism does not prevent speech, it compels speech. When I speak, Barthes says that I can, this is a quote, I can speak only by picking up what loiters around in speech. Which means, when I speak, I'm compelled through my desire to be understood or what have you, by way of communicability and iterability, to voice what already loiters in speech. I am bound when I speak to speak what can be recognized, followed, repeated, shared, understood, etc. For Barthes, this presents a tremendous limit to language, a limit always subjugated by an ineradicable servility to power. It's not particularly clear, and Barthes doesn't himself clarify, exactly why this compelling to speak what loiters in speech is decidedly fascist. One might therefore be tempted to accuse him of hyperbole, or at least of conflating fascism with a more general sense of violence. But Victor Klemperer's book, The Language of the Third Reich, is actually quite instructive on this point. Klemperer's philological project addresses the particular contortions of the German language during the Hitler era, and by pointing out how everyday German words incorporate fascist ideologies of blood, nation, militarism, rhetoric, fanaticism, industrial production, and so on. Klemperer points out that these linguistic cliches, to use Barthes' terminology, compel the German speaker to speak, and thus to remain at least minimally complicit with the Nazism that loiters within this language. This is why Klemperer describes the language of the Third Reich as a poison throughout his book, but this is also why he describes cliché as, quote, language which writes and thinks for you. Fascism so intimately embraces cliché of speech that replaces thinking, Klemperer argues, as part of fascism's generalized attack against rationality, its replacement of reason with devotional belief, and its subordination of the individual to the administrative ranks and hierarchies of the nation. Klemperer's definition of cliché as language which writes and thinks for you grasps Barthes' characterization of the loitering nature of speech. Language is fascist, returning back to Barthes, because it is always at least minimally cliché. And as we learned from Klemperer's analysis of these lexical emergences in German, fascism is the rhetorical and ideological elevation of cliché par excellence. In this sense, language is not the innocent victim of fascist violence, as if fascism would invade from outside an otherwise peacefully uncontaminated German, or really any language. This cliché comprises the constitutive risk of language to abuse, contortion, and weaponization from the start. Barthes' question then is, what could possibly resist this binding of language to cliché? His answer, predictably, is literature. Literature comprises an outside, he says, to the cliched proximity of language to power. The outside is Barthes' word. And literature therefore remains for Barthes this retains this redemptive capacity, which he describes as a type of non-assertive neutrality to rescue language from its fascistic forces. Barthes does not elaborate how literature rescues language from fascism. This is, after all, not really the point of his lecture. And so I leave him here simply by noting that this seemingly post-violent gesture in this brief moment of Barthes's appraisal of literature. So if the repeatability and recognizability, which is to say the iterability of speech, makes it cliché and thus fascistic, then Barthes's defense of an idiomatic relation to language, an idiom he calls literature, would presumably, as this so-called outside, reclaim a type of peace. This at least seems to be the logic, at least. Recently, one of the most ardent defenders of this non-violent structure of literature is Marc Crépon, who even goes so far to argue in the Vocation of Writing that non-violence plays such a determinative role in the vocation of literature that any literature that violently instrumentalizes language ultimately renounces literature altogether. Throughout his work, Crépon wants to develop an inherently ethical sense of literature, tasked with a fundamental resistance to every violence. As Crépon puts it, anti-Semitism and racism are provocations that, quote, breach the contract, end quote, that literature aspires to sustain, namely the responsibility for the care, help, and attention that the vulnerability and mortality of the other demands. Literature sustains this contract by giving voice to the singularity of the victim, the idiom of his or her address, in the face of the homogeneity, the erasure of singularity that persecutory violence mobilizes. So he aligns violence with homogeneity, singularity with the protection of the victim. This is what literature does. In this sense, according to Crépon, violence and literature are mutually exclusive. So much so that in this framework, nonviolence seems to behave as the very essence of literature. Literature's law, as Crépon calls it, is in this sense inherently post-violent for him. Because for him, literature names the reclamation or return of language, or at least the faith in the possibility of this reclamation or return of language to a non-violence. Treated in this way, violence would only amount to an invasion upon or perversion of an original primary peacefulness. And literature, its idiom, its rescue of the singularity of the victim from the homogenizing forces of violence, names this ethics of peace, this nonviolence. Taken in this way, the aspiration of post-violence literature is thus inherently ethical for Crépon. He even says it is ethics itself, insofar as any ethics worthy of the name recognizes the singularity of the other as singular and as other, rather than as an instrument or means towards some ulterior end. Although Crépon does not directly discuss forgiveness in this moment, the logic here, I think, is clear to extend it to one of forgiveness. Forgiveness forgives a prior violence, at least in the commonplace use of the word forgiveness, and in doing so, aligns with literature's idiomatic intervention into violence's homogenizing force. Of course, Crépon develops this sense of literature from Derrida, but he's keenly aware that Derrida emphasizes that an idiom, quote, is never pure, because its iterability opens it up to others. This is what Derrida says in the interview with Derek Attridge, called The Strange Institution Called Literature. Moreover, since Derrida expresses this inherent contamination of the idiom in an interview about the very possibility of literature, it's also clear that for Derrida, literature finds itself in the irresolvable balance between the singularity of the idiom and the homogeneity of the legible. The poetics of witnessing that Derrida enumerates in Sovereignties in Question follows a similar trajectory. The witnessed experience is absolutely singular. And yet to testify on behalf of this exclusive singularity requires that the witness render that experience articulable, communicable, and comprehensible to others. Others who, by definition, are outside the experience being communicated. Not only does this mean that we receive testimony largely on faith, but it also means that a singular experience rendered communicable, the veracity of the testimony always and unavoidably remains vulnerable to fiction. In short, the iterability of the idiom denies the idiom its idiomaticity. Initially, Crépon seems to insist that violence is located beyond the vocation of literature's idiomatic protection of singularity. In this sense, violence would be nothing other than the series of historical, empirical efforts to erase the singularity of its victims. For example, in the fascist protocols of the Third Reich. Yet, if literature acquires its ethics of nonviolence, because it stands on the side of the idiom, and thus counters the homogeneity of violence, then the idiom, even to be recognized as an idiom, must unavoidably traffic in the very homogeneity it resists. Violence, it appears, has no after or outside, even in the name of being literature, of being ethical, or of being, as it were, post-violent. To this point, Rodolphe Gachet adds that the ability to commit violence against language, which comprises the bulk of Crépon's focus in the Vocation of Writing, and which also, of course, Klemperer develops in his book, already assumes a more originary violence at work within language. While reading of grammatology, specifically the section Derrida devotes to Lévi-Strauss on the violence of the letter, Gachet argues that the violence, quote, that befalls spoken language from without is made possible from within by speech by an originary violence, end quote. In these pages, Derrida accuses Lévi-Strauss of conceiving violence in strictly an empirical sense, as if violence behaves as an accident that imposes itself exteriorly upon a terrain of innocence, as Derrida characterizes it. To treat violence as something imposed, as something that intervenes, as something that comes from outside, assumes a prior peace or nonviolence that this violence will have destroyed. However, as Gachet points out, Derrida here argues that an empirical intervention of violence is itself the result of a more constitutive archaeviolence, which for Derrida means, quote, this is from grammatology, the loss of the proper, of absolute proximity, of self-presence. In short, archaeviolence names the very chance of relation, and thus of communication, and even of ethics, since it accounts for the phenomenological exposure to alterity, but also closes the possibility of an absolutely pure idiom. So if we can positively say that literature resists violence by essentially rescuing singularity from violence's homogenizing grip, then literature's inherent nonviolence also commits violence and cannot help but do so. Because at the end of the day, an idiom that remains absolutely idiomatic would destroy the very ground of iterability as such. In the name of nonviolence, a uniquely idiomatic idiom would be the most violent. If the idiom is both impossible and necessary, this is because, in order to be even potentially comprehensible, every utterance must be, on the one hand, distinguishably unique and at least minimally uniform, whereas Celan says addressable, and therefore, in short, at least minimally violent for its homogenizing gesture. It's precisely for this reason of the impossibility of a uniquely idiomatic idiom that Derrida calls literature a strange institution. Literature never appears as such. It is strange or foreign to itself, always estranged from itself, impure. It loses itself in the phenomenality of its appearance, which is never literature pure and simple. In short, for there to be literature, for there to be this reclamation of singularity of the idiom, there is no literature, or as Derrida puts it in Dissemination, ever so little literature. Because this reclamation must, to some degree, traffic, as I already said, in the very abuse and appropriation that it resists. Perhaps no example is more evident of this problem than a statement of forgiveness voiced singularly by a victim in the language shared with his or her oppressor. This was which is what's accounted for example, again, in the German language by Jean-Marie, right? The language of, he doesn't call it reconciliation, but to come to terms with the sort of abuses against him, right? He has only available to him the sort of cultural and linguistic references of German culture and German language, this shared language. So without saying so, I've been slowly circling back to this issue of cliché and defending an unavoidable, indeed constitutive structure of cliché against the so-called outside of fascism that literature would somehow redeem in the way that Barthes and Crépon differently sort of demonstrated. Am I okay on time?
2 minutes.
3 minutes, okay. So I'll summarize just the last sort of point, which is just to bring up one example from the work of Charlotte Delbo, a member of the French resistance and Holocaust survivor, who would later sort of pen her testimony of the death camps in her book, Auschwitz and After. And she calls what I'm calling this constitutive failure of post-violence literature cliché. This is what she calls it. She calls it cliché. So in a very subtle but important moment in her memoir, Delbo recalls to the reader, she's speaking directly to the reader, the moment that she was allowed a last visit with her husband before his execution. To summarize it very briefly, Delbo provides a series of what she admits to be insufficient and trifling and stock descriptions of the love she and he shared. And then exclaims at the end, quote, "Why must your cliches always triumph in the end?" So she's explaining, I loved my husband for this reason, but that's a trifling reason. I love my husband for this reason, but that's a insufficient reason. I love him. And then at the end she says, in this frustrated sort of way, well, why must the readers, cliches always triumph in the end? And so the your is clearly the impersonal general reader, the you Delbo addresses throughout her book. We, sort of as Delbo's readers, who did not endure her unique set of experiences, who want to understand what she cannot communicate, compel, to use Barth's term, her cliches. Her choice to describe the love for her husband by evoking all these things, like I love him sort of in the face of his death, right? All this sort of romantic sort of, that love is sort of best expressed in this moment of his death and all this sort of stuff. She says, are demanded of her, right, in order to tell a love story, but this is of course insufficient. It must be tragic, the story, it must be fated, doomed, if it's going to be magnificent, she says. And she says, this is something that you, the reader, are putting on me. But this is the best that she can do to account for this love that she had with her husband. But merely fulfilling uniform expectations of what counts as a magnificent love fails to capture the singular experience Delbo tries to describe because it relies on a credit, an exchange with the reader. And this is her frustration. The only way to account for her love is via cliché. And then on my last point though, however, this is the double bind that Delbo is, I think, probably most known for. The cliché though is true. And at least in this case, our frustrations with cliché would not be frustrating if the cliché wasn't at least minimally truthful, and thus, as Delbo says, triumphant. The cliché is triumphant in the end because it accounts for precisely what is addressable in language. And this addressability is what gets exploited, Klemperer argues, by the cliched language of the Third Reich. The cliché's diminishment of this range of experience is also the possibility of its communicability, precisely because you cannot understand my love, or you cannot understand my experience in the camps. I have to have recourse to what you can understand. I have to render this homogenized, communicable, interpretable in some sense, and therefore the cliché triumphs. And so in just conclusion, to summarize the last bit of this, what I kind of want to point out is that this idea that the cliché is just simply the emptiness of thoughtless sort of speech also still seems to be the very possibility of communication in some sense. And therefore, it remains ineradicable structurally. But this not only emphasizes that violence is not an exterior intrusion upon an otherwise purely non-violent and peaceful structure of language, but that this exposure of language to cliché mobilizes the infinite task of literature from the start. And so I'll leave it there for want of time, but thank you.